We are starting our webinar this morning on dehydrating food by preserving it with Hal Ming. And we will wait a few minutes to see if we can get everyone in. I am sending a welcome note, and let me know please if you can see this in the chat. We had some problems with the chat the last time, and I've gone through and double checked all the settings, and it says it's working. If you have questions and you want to, oh good, you can see it, great. If you have questions or comments for Hal or for me, put them in the chat if you would please. You can use the Q&A, but if we use the chat, then everybody can see the questions and the answers. Otherwise, if it's in the Q&A, we usually answer those live. And then I don't know that Hal can see the chat while his PowerPoint is up. So I will, if we get questions, I will probably just pop up on the screen periodically and let Hal know that we have questions at an appropriate time. A little slow coming in today. I don't want to delay this too long because we don't want to edit out a bunch of material. I will introduce Hal and we will go through our introductions, and by then maybe we'll have enough people in and we'll go ahead and start our webinar. So Hal Ming has done several webinars with us. He's done a lot with other groups. He has a lot of information on his website that he'll tell you about. He's the executive director of the Center for Food Preservation Arts, and that's a nonprofit of sorts in the sense that it's not profit making exactly, but they're not profit making at all. They are under the umbrella of, I'm not sure who now, Hal will tell you, but they are not a profit making group. So they work with the community on preserving food and helping those who have food shortage needs. So Hal, I will turn this over to you and let you introduce more about yourself.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, it's always a pleasure to do these webinars, particularly with the EnviroHouse. Always have good experiences. Really like to reach out and talk to people. Before the pandemic, most of the work we did was very much hands-on, and we've only in the last year been able to come back to that. But, you know, as they say, always look for the uses of adversity. And we were able to reach out and start having more of a way of presenting in ways that people have it accessible. We have a YouTube channel now where things like this are either linked to, or we have some original productions there also, besides all the workshops we do. So it's a fairly, a lot of information in today's presentation. So I don't want to talk too much about myself and about Center for Food Preservation Arts as an organization, but just to kind of put it in context, we're what's been called a collaborative, in that we work with a lot of nonprofits. A few of them work as our physical sponsors when we get those kind of grants, and others are food banks and feeding ministries in their own right. And so we work with them, working with donations of produce to turn them into jams and jellies in our program, the Preserving for the Hungry. We also have community canning classes, and then we do these online workshops and informational sessions. So I always appreciate people having questions. Won't stop all the time for them, but if you put them in the chat, then we can save them up and at an appropriate place answer them. At the end of the presentation about dehydrating foods, we'll have some time to answer questions that may not be related to dehydrating. So let's go ahead.
Now, before you start, I just mentioned that you have slides at the end of your presentation with resources. And I will put some of those resources in the chat. The slideshow is this is all being recorded. And as soon as our media folks have an opportunity to get to it, that will be uploaded on the city's YouTube channel, so you can come back and see it later. And in those resources, it will have links to Hal's CFPA website and blog, and there's a ton of information there. So do follow up and check that out and sign up for his newsletter, and you'll just have a wealth of information. So, okay, carry on.
All right, thank you. So jumping right in here, this is kind of a montage of all the different ways that we work with the community. I don't know if my little picture's in front of it, but you can see, I'm hoping you can see the pointer. I'm never quite sure. Sometimes it doesn't appear, but we work with all different groups of people. And some of the classes even can have some very young people come to them. These are some pictures from Preserving for the Hungry. You can see we use all different kinds of volunteers. During the pandemic, we even found a way to continue that work while being socially distanced. I don't know if you can see my arm here, but that 6 feet is as close as we got to each other. And then we also try and have some fun. We were making sauerkraut, and I had come across some of the biggest cabbages I'd ever seen. So we had a little fun with them and shot a bunch of pictures with what we could do as a cabbage. So getting into the topic for today is dehydrating. And it's been used as far back as they have records of it being deliberately used to preserve food, back Babylonian, Egyptian, and even further back. The way that dehydrating works is that microorganisms need water available to them within the food to grow. And dehydration removes enough of that available water that it inhibits the growth. Now, you don't want to lose, you want to maintain as much of the nutrients as texture as possible. So you use a low temperature and a steady airflow. So the food is basically uncooked, which means that you do have to be careful with it in the way you store it. But in an airtight container after it's dehydrated and at room or lower temperature and out of sunlight, dehydrated food can last for a very, very long time without additional electricity or energy, like with a refrigerator or a freezer. And some of the reasons that we want to dehydrate foods at home is it expands our food options. Like, for example, I have a cabinet in the basement that is filled with jars of even small quantities of different things I've dehydrated that I don't always have to be running in and out into the store, especially right now with gas prices. We can control the ingredients. We can leave out things that we may not like. Even some regular dehydrated things sometimes have chemicals added to them to increase the shelf storage length. And we can leave those out entirely. I keep my dehydrator out, and when I have a small amount of something or a couple of different things, I'll go ahead and dehydrate it, so we're reducing food waste. And that will help us to reduce the cost of the food. And as I mentioned before, it's very convenient to have a well-stocked pantry. And dehydrated foods that you stored give us faster cooking options. And they can also make a better use of storage space. Some foods, when you dehydrate them, will reduce in size as much as almost 60%. And you can use the foods to create your own backpacking meals or emergency meals. And emergencies can be something as simple as a power outage or a financial reversal. But those things can be very handy. And in part because we can control some of the ingredients, as I've mentioned, they can make special diet options, things that are low carb or things that you might not have ever had before. And so we'll touch a little bit more detail on all of these topics. But jumping in here, the very first air dryer I ever had was the one that's on the right of the screen. And I still have it. And it works in summer, especially at the time like we had before. You can see it has a nice screen on it that helps keep any insects out. And you just need free airflow and a temperature that's, well, this would have been perfect when it was above 90 degrees in my kitchen. But one of the other ways that was very traditional is to dry herbs in bundles. And anywhere that there's good airflow, and I just happen to see this picture. I've never owned a rack like that. I just hang things in my attic sometimes. But with the airflow, you can dehydrate herbs very easily in your kitchen. And then here are some homemade solar dehydrators. Don't always work in this climate, but in July here and into August, we have the opportunity if you want to look into those. But, you know, an electric dehydrator is the usual way folks go. And we'll talk more in detail about what are available there. But some alternatives you can get started with are using your oven or your microwave. And in the resource lists that we'll give you links to, there is some information on using either of those. But now into the thing that's the most used are the electric dehydrators. They all have a heat source and they can come in two main styles. They're ones where the heat comes from the back and flows out over the trays like this. And the Excalibur is another model that uses that principle. And then there are the older styles where the heat comes from the bottom and flows up and then recycles back down. So the features that they should all have is they need to work at low temperatures. So the range is usually anywhere between 90 and 170 degrees, but the average is about 95 to 165. They need a steady airflow and a variable temperature control. And it's really nice to have a timer, sometimes as much as 24 hours, particularly if you have a dehydrator you're going to use to make something like a jerky or something like that. Durable materials, I prefer ones where as much of it is made of metal as possible. But of course, especially right now, those are even more expensive. So the ones that you have like plastic trays work just fine. There's usually a number of sizes, including the size of the footprint, the tray, and the number of trays that they have. And you can spend anything from very inexpensive to like a professional grade dehydrator that is a lot more than what I think most of us would like to spend for a home dehydrator. Should always look for at least a 1-year warranty. And if you expect from experience like I have to be using your dehydrator a lot, you may want to look at the extended warranty. And this just gives you a little look at a little close-up of some of the features on the Excalibur dehydrator. So here you have the temperature setting, and you can see it goes from below, or starts at 95, goes up to the 165. Timer goes as much as 26 hours. And the Excalibur has plastic trays. And the tray is just a framework that holds often these sheets. They're made of like a nylon material, much heavier than nylon though, that allows the air to flow in and out through them. And then if you're putting something that's liquid on them, you have these Teflon type sheets. And it doesn't get hot enough in there. Some people worry when I say Teflon, because of the Teflon pads and pans and the worry about scraping off. Well, you're never scraping on these with anything metal, which would break up the Teflon. And also, they don't get to the heat that they would get in a cooking vessel. And that would also help with breaking down the Teflon. And so you just have basically the tray, and then on the tray you have the mesh net, and then you have the sheet. And that's when we're making leathers and things, which we'll show in more detail a little bit later. And what features should they have? Well, working at the low temperature, steady airflow, all of those things that we'd already talked about. And then we'll jump into what the source of the produce can be for the things you're dehydrating. But at this point, has anybody thrown in anything in the chat or comments that we should pause for?
We had a comment on from someone who said she dehydrates tomato skins and grinds them up into a powder. And I think you have a powdered tomato recipe that is included.
Yep, that's coming up a little bit later. It's part of another kind of workshop that I teach. That's one of the things that we call using the whole hog. It goes back to the idea that back when they were really reliant on the livestock, they would use, the old joke was we use every part of the pig except the squeal. And if it's all possible and safe, we use every part of the produce that we get. So here you just have an example of starting with fresh produce. And then here, this top row is what it looks like after it's prepped. Now, pretty much all fruits and vegetables require a little bit of some kind of pre-treatment to keep them from changing color. Like potatoes, if they sit out, for example, or you dehydrate them, they'll have a tendency to darken a lot, maybe even turn black. And if you blanch them in hot water a little bit, then it stops that enzyme process. Other things like fruit, you would pre-treat them in a slightly acid bath. So we have the potatoes. What they look like is as homemade potato slices dehydrated. Sweet potatoes, and you can see that different vegetables have a little bit more water content, and so they get a lot smaller. Zucchinis, just straight zucchini, not a zucchini chip, but we'll talk about those later. And carrots and dehydrated carrots. I keep hitting the wrong arrow, sorry about that. Then here's some example of fruits. The banana, of course. You can pre-treat that with those slices with a little bit of acid, and that keeps them from turning quite as dark. The kiwis, of course, we mash up and turn into a kiwi leather that I like to break some of it up and mix it as a powder with making muffins to add a kiwi flavor to it. Apples, of course, and peaches. These peach slices were pre-treated, but for some reason it didn't quite take. So sometimes that happens. You can also, especially if you're making things to go in preparing emergency meal packages or backpacking, you can start out with canned vegetables and canned tomatoes. And those work just fine. Here's an example of in the can, and then what they look like after the dehydrate. And you can see the variety of textures when we dehydrate this mixed vegetable. And also frozen. If you get a really good deal on some frozen vegetables and you're starting to run out of freezer space, or you know you're going to be wanting some of them for backpacking, you can just defrost them. They've usually all been pre-blanched or pre-treated. So pretty much it's just drying them off after they defrost put them on the tray, and go for it. So we'll pause for a second, ask if there are any more comments or questions. Then we'll get into how you use this.
None yet, but if you folks have questions, please put them in the chat, or if you don't want to type them out or can't, you can, at the end, if we have time, you can raise your hand and we'll try to unmute you and see if you can do it that way.
That sounds good. Lots of options there. Just like what you do with the product after you've made it. Now, this is a whole jar. It's a 2-quart jar filled with dehydrated potato slices, which you can use for a lot of different things. Backpacking, au gratin, you can rehydrate them and mash them. You can also dehydrate mashed potatoes. We might talk a little bit about that. But just in the simplest way is to place the potato slices in a bowl, add boiling water to cover, and you allow them to sit for 15 minutes or sometimes a little bit longer to rehydrate. But the rehydrating process is often built right into the recipes. So here is a recipe, and you can call the full thing up by going to this address that's down at the bottom. But it's really simple. It starts with the sliced dehydrated potatoes, and this is a very rich recipe. The butter, the flour, the milk, cheddar cheese, spices, garnishes, and basically it cooks in that liquid. So you really only have to follow the directions, which is just basically heating up the milk and putting a little bit of the flour in it and the butter, start thickening it, add the shredded cheese, and pour it over the potatoes and bake it, potato slices. And it is delicious. And the same principle for making some low carb zucchini chips. And you also have the option after you've sliced them by hand or with the mandolin, as you see in the picture to the left there. You can also like dip them or spray them with some kind of seasoning, like a little bit of oil with a vinegar. You can sprinkle any kind of a spice mixture over them. You can use any of those different kinds of recipes that are available for making low carb zucchini chips. You can also make flavored carrot chips, all of those things.
We did get 2 questions here.
All righty.
Can you flavor with sauces before dehydrating, or does that alter the effectiveness?
It will slow it down. You want to follow a recipe. I wouldn't try to dehydrate like the scalloped or au gratin potatoes that have dairy in them. Dairy changes, and it's not always 100% safe when you home dehydrate it. That's a lot like freeze dryers are useful for, but those are often very much out of the reach of folks because they take up a lot of room and they're very expensive to buy and to run. But dehydrating and freeze drying are 2 different processes. And I'll talk a little bit more about that, but anything that has a high fat content usually doesn't dehydrate well. But anything that has almost no fat content, like a light oil, vinegar, spices, those can all be done ahead of time. I hope that makes sense.
Okay. Can you, another question was on vegetables, zucchini chips and other things. How thick should they be for the different vegetables?
It usually, the recipe, if you look at one, tells you, but I would start certainly not really approaching 1/4 of an inch. I would say under 1/4 of an inch. If you have oh, I can't remember, but all the mandolins, all the slicers that I have are in metric, and I can't remember, the millimeter, but fairly small, because you don't want to spend a lot. You don't want to spend like 24 hours dehydrating them, and you want to make sure that they end up crispy if you're using them as chips per se. Now, something like the au gratin potatoes would be a little thicker. And a lot of it is also trial and error. It depends on what kind of a dehydrator you get. And also if you are soaking them in anything beforehand or spraying on it.
Or if you're like me, when you're slicing, they never even anyway, so you get a mix.
That's true, but that's why I got a mandolin. That's one of the things, nice point out. You really should strive to get everything of a very similar thickness if possible. Because if you don't, you're going to spend a lot of time hand picking out the ones that aren't quite done yet. So, and then putting them back in.
Okay, we have one more question come in. Is there any place to rent time with a freeze dryer?
Renting time with a freeze dryer, not that I've run across. The only place, only tool library per se, that I've ever seen that is loaning them out was Federal Way, solid waste department. I don't know if they're even still doing that. As I mentioned, they're quite big, they're expensive, they're very noisy. Very few people, I think, agencies want to make that investment unless they know they're going to use it or have a built-in clientele. But if somebody who has a lot of money would like to research setting it up, I'll be glad to help in any way I can, because I would love to rent one and use one.
Okay, so one more quick one, and then we'll go back to the presentation and hold any others for a little bit. Person has 4 and 6 millimeter blades, trying to figure out which one to use.
Experiment. But I mean, it depends on what you're doing too, and whether you want it to be really, really crispy or dehydrate fast. I've used the 4 a lot for things like the different kinds of chips. And then also, then we come, speaking of things that are thin, healthy treats, like a mixed berry fruit roll-up. A lot of these recipes that you'll find put additional sweeteners in, like honey, things like that. I'm diabetic, so even just plain fruit, I can't eat a lot of. And the fruit does concentrate when you turn them into the roll-ups. So it has really good, especially for backpacking and emergency situations where you need a lot of fast energy, because it's compact. It stores well if it's airtight and kept out of extreme heat or light. And this is just an example of making the roll-ups. After it's dried into a somewhat flexible leather, you just cut it into sections like that, and I roll mine up inside the paper to keep it from sticking to each other, and then go ahead and cut those up into bite-sized pieces you can unroll. And then there's also some things you might not have thought of, is like making coconut yogurt drops. And all that's in them is a heavy yogurt and coconut. And it's just very simple. And when it says the Paraflex sheet, those are just the standard Teflon sheets that you can order for dehydrators anywhere. That just happens to be a brand name. I don't know why we chose to put that instead of just putting Teflon sheets. But just mix it together well, drop it on with a spoon, or you can use any one of those cookie, I don't even know what they call them, the cookie things. I think you know what I'm talking about if you do any baking, where you squeeze it and it dumps it on. Scoop, the scoop. But yeah, they will keep for a very long time. They're less likely, if you keep them airtight and cool, to have the possibility of going stale like just regular shredded coconut will do. And then that just shows another picture of making them. And I've chosen to flatten them a little bit. Oops, and then we're jumping ahead. So one more opportunity for questions before we jump in, and we'll go through the whole backpacking emergency meal thing and then take more questions. So do we have any right now?
No, you're good.
All right. So this is one of the things that always fascinated me and got me into dehydrating. I, as an individual, had lived through what might be called 4, sometimes depending on how you slice it, 5 natural disasters. Forest fire, a big tropical storm in Houston, Texas, where the main street of Houston, boats were going up and down it. Teton Dam flood, which destroyed, when the dam broke, destroyed my parents' home in the city of Rexburg, Idaho. Different things like that got me interested in working with preparedness, not in terms of like the razor wire doomsday things, but working with organizations to help people be prepared for reversibles, long-term issues and problems. I've done some work with volunteer work with FEMA and ARES and the CERT program. And I became interested in what we could do to prepare food-wise that would be portable and not take a lot of storage space, and also was within price reach. And that brought me into the whole dehydrating and even purchasing things freeze-dried to supplement. And so here we have 2 examples. One is a veggie soup mix that was made out of canned beans and fresh vegetables, and then a 3-bean mix. Once again, the peas that I used and the green beans that I dehydrated were from my garden. Supplemented that with some dehydrated black beans and carrots for flavor and onions. Once you have the ingredients made, you can go ahead and put them into Ziploc baggies with labeling and some instructions on them. Or if you have like a seal a meal or a food saver, you can suck all the air out of them and they'll keep even longer and be a little bit more compact. Things like noodles, you don't really dehydrate yourself, but you can add those in because they're already dehydrated. And giving credit, this is a photo that I got to use from yummylife.com. They do a lot of things for backpacking. And then this shows you packets for entire meals. Like you see, you have a packet for coffee. I have to have coffee. Dehydrated fruit, protein-enriched instant oatmeal, which we have a recipe in our resources for. You can also add freeze-dried eggs, sausage, or bacon. And that brings us then again back to the whole thing with eggs and meat and dehydrating. It really is safer and works better if you go ahead and spring for buying some of the freeze-dried, or if you have access to a freeze dryer. Maybe a group of people can get together, and one option that I'd forgotten about was putting a call for out there for someone who owns one of those and see if they want to work with you for a share of what you dehydrate, or not dehydrate, what you freeze dry, or even maybe they'll work out a kind of rental thing. But that would be something I haven't explored, but I've heard of it in other parts of the country being done. And so this then was a meal more towards dinner with bean, vegetable, and noodles. And that's the packet. You add the meat afterwards. And you have tea instead of coffee at that time of day. You have some almonds. And then I've been accused of putting a set of dice in there for some reason. those are bouillon cubes. Those are pre-made bouillon cubes. That has a lot of salt in it, but if you don't put salt in anything else, that usually, especially if it's in a disaster or backpacking situation, is necessary. But you can also just include a little packet that you make up of, like I buy different kinds of salt-free bouillons or stock flavorings, and then put an amount, an individual serving of it in a packet of some kind, and then vacuum seal it. And then going a little bit deeper, here is after you pureed your vegetables or your tomatoes. In this case, we're making tomato leathers and spreading them on the sheet for the dehydrating process. And once they are really fully dehydrated, then you get to the point where the difference between a leather and a bark. Leathers are usually almost always fruits, and they have retained enough water to be very pliable and chewable. But on the other hand, there are the barks. And the purpose of bark is to get as much of the liquid and the moisture out as possible so that they're really brittle. And then you store them, and when you use them, you grind them up, like using the corn bark to make a base for a corn soup, or the potato bark as an addition to a potato soup or other stews. You can also use strawberry barks as a flavoring in baking, and the kiwi barks. And so here's an example of making a tomato paste, and then you grind it up and add the spices that you see here for a tomato herb seasoning. And what's really great, as someone had pointed out, is, for example, in a salsa recipe, which we are doing a workshop at Trinity Lutheran Church this Saturday. There are very few slots left, but it's making salsa. And it's a salsa recipe where you chop up the tomatoes, and then you drain them for a couple of hours so that it immediately starts as a nice thick salsa. And that juice, you can reduce it down and then dehydrate it. But before I do that, I like to include the tomato skins, because you want to peel the tomatoes when you're making salsas usually. And so those tomato skins, as someone had already mentioned earlier, added with the juice, cooked down a little bit, then dehydrated, makes an excellent tomato, quotes, paste leather that can be used for a lot of different things. And then getting into some of the other foods. You want to cook any of the grains that you might dehydrate, like lentils, rice, oat groats, things like that. Because if you don't, it's going to take much longer cooking time. It's sort of like dehydrating like black beans or kidney beans. The whole idea is for it to take far less time and less energy, and for it to store longer. And so any cooked grains, if you follow suggested recipes and times, can be dehydrated. As we mentioned before, low-fat meats and seafoods can be dehydrated, but you're going to need to heat it to at least 165 some other way, or cook it completely before dehydrating. And then you want to be careful to not dehydrate things with high fat contents. And eggs, things like with those contents, and eggs especially, should be freeze-dried, because eggs are a real vehicle for salmonella in various forms. So it's worth it to avoid the risk and buy some of those things freeze-dried, or get them freeze-dried by a friend, or find some way to co-op a freeze dryer. And this brings us towards the end here. that very first, the tinyurl.com /EH Dehydrating is where you can find a couple of long lists of resources. A lot of information about general dehydrating and different angles on it all. And then the second one is a whole list of recipes, both for in making backpack meals and also for just using your dehydrated materials. We have a Facebook page where we pretty much 4 times a week print articles or links to information or things like that. We have a YouTube channel, as I mentioned, and the website has even more in-depth articles. And then we have our email. And talking a little bit more about our Preserving for the Hungry program, it's a program where we work with food banks and feeding ministries to turn usually surplus or gleaned fruits and vegetables into products that, because we're working under Department of Agriculture permitting, we're able to hand out through the food banks or feeding ministries. And we always need donations of supplies, and funds are always needed for our program because we're a collaborative program in that we work with other organizations who are nonprofits. And I was laughing before, is Center for Food Preservation Arts is not a nonprofit, not by design. We managed to keep it going, but it is not, the goal is not to be marketing and making a lot of money off of it. And then I always, it's kind of a placeholder, like to leave up this information so that you can reconnect and work with the other programs at the EnviroHouse, which is a wonderful organization and has been a good partner with us. So it was wide open now, Yolanda.
Wide open for questions. And I put probably over half of the information in your resource list in the chat. And for those of you who are still on here, you should be able to do either a control all, or I think maybe the page at the bottom by where it says to everyone, and do a copy where you can copy everything on that chat. If you want to get that before the video is up online. And then also, if you would like, I can, because I'm pulling these all kind of from a cheat sheet, I can email you the cheat sheet that I've got, because we have fewer than 20 people on here today, so that isn't too cumbersome. I usually try to do that one at a time rather than blind copy, because that doesn't work very well. So I would be happy to do that. And if you have any other questions for Hal, we do have another webinar with Hal coming up on a Saturday morning on the 13th on pickling cucumbers and vegetables. That's online. And then for those of you that might be interested in trees, we are doing a webinar on Wednesday the 10th with our urban forestry folks. Lisa Kinney will be presenting information on Grit City trees, how to get them, what kind of trees you can get, a little bit on planting, and just some general information on trees. We're planning September into November webinars, and we'll continue doing those as webinars rather than workshops for the present time. But the EnviroHouse is open for visits now. We're open Thursday through Sunday from 11 to 5. And then I'm working remotely on Wednesdays and Tuesdays as needed. So hope you can come by and see us, and I will just go ahead and send all this information out to everybody. And if you have no other questions, I don't see anything in here. So
I just want to let people know that we're at the point now, if you had any other burning questions about any type of food preservation, I can do my best to answer them. I'm a certified food preservation technician. They no longer allow us to call ourselves master preservers because copyright crap stuff that I'm sorry. Anyway, so I do have experience in a lot of different forms, and if you have other questions, please feel free. We'll take just a couple of minutes here.
And I did put Hal's email and other information, Facebook, YouTube, and website in the chat, so you can get that. And I think with my information in there and with Hal's in there, that should cover it. We don't have any other questions coming in, Hal, but we have a lot of thank yous. So,
thank you. Well, thank you. And if you are interested in any of our upcoming workshops, we announce them first on our Facebook page. But if you go to our blog page, there's an education page, and that usually lays out what we have a month or two in advance and options for signing up for those. We have some workshops at Trinity Lutheran Church in Parkland coming up. I mentioned the tomato salsa one this Saturday. A couple of weeks after that, we have one on making sauerkraut. And then the last one would be August 27th on making a traditional corn relish. So check out all those pages. You don't have to sign up or follow them forever, but just see what our content's like.
And you might also check the Tacoma Tool Library if you don't have all the tools and equipment that you need. They have some cooking and preparation materials. I'm not sure what all, but they do have some things. And library resources for books, that sort of thing. And then also, if you have fruit trees or if you have excess produce that you're growing at home, don't forget the Pierce County Gleaning Project. I can give you information on that too. So, okay, thank you, everybody. Hope you have a couple minutes to get a little bite to eat if you didn't eat while you were watching, and we will see you later. Join us again for cucumbers and pickling. Thanks, Hal.
Thank you.
Goodbye.